Imagine a world where the icy wastelands at the very edge of the map hold secrets so profound they could rewrite everything we think we know about the end of World War II and the shadowy birth of the Cold War. Where lost German expeditions vanish beneath the Antarctic ice, where massive US naval armadas sail into the frozen unknown and then abruptly turn back in silence. Where rumours of hidden technologies, covert bases and powerful unseen hands manipulating global events swirl just beneath the surface of official history. My name is Finn, and today we're going to journey into one of the most mysterious, controversial and flat-out fascinating chapters of modern history, a story that stretches from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from secret laboratories to the cold, empty skies over the South Pole. Before we start, please remember to subscribe and like the video. Both help me and the channel a ton. Thank you so much. So settle in, because by the end of this video, you might find yourself questioning just how much of our past, and maybe even our present, still lies buried under the ice. It is barely in mainstream histories that in the closing months of 1938, just on the cusp of the Second World War, the renowned American polar explorer Admiral Richard E. Byrd made a notable visit to Hamburg, Germany. During this time, Byrd was extended an invitation by German officials to join their forthcoming Antarctic venture, an ambitious expedition under the auspices of the National Socialist government aimed at exploring and staking claims in the polar south. Despite Byrd's unparalleled expertise in Arctic and Antarctic expeditions, he ultimately declined the offer. Nevertheless, the Germans pressed on with their plans. On December 17, 1938, the vessel Neuschwabenland, a freighter specially retrofitted to carry catapult-launched aircraft, departed Hamburg on a voyage that would carry profound geopolitical undertones. The expedition comprised 33 scientific and technical members, supported by a crew of 24 aboard the Neuschwabenland itself. By January 1939, the Germans reached Antarctic waters, steering into an area Norway had already laid claim to in 1938, naming it Queen Maud Land. In the ensuing weeks, the expedition undertook a total of 15 aerial survey flights using 2 Dornier Wal seaplanes. Their sorties meticulously charted an estimated 600,000 square kilometers of largely unclaimed ice and rock. Asserting German territorial interests, the expedition installed 3 physical markers, iron poles approximately 5 feet high, topped with National Socialist symbols, along the coastline. 13 additional markers were scattered inland by air, and the region was subsequently renamed by Germany as Neuschwabenland. Rumours at the time, and later speculations, suggested that the Germans harboured intentions far beyond mere cartographic curiosity. Contemporary German publications even floated the idea of utilising Antarctica as a proving ground for advanced weapons research, flight experiments, and potentially as a fallback enclave should war engulf Europe unfavourably for Germany. These narratives aligned with broader ambitions tied to the so-called 4-year plan, an economic and strategic initiative aiming to prepare Germany for prolonged conflict and expansion, including the possibility of establishing colonial outposts as far afield as Antarctica. The 1939 expedition reported some startling natural discoveries: ice-free lakes warmed by geothermal activity, and sizable deposits of coal and other minerals beneath the Antarctic crust. Such findings ignited the imagination of influential figures like Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, who began to quietly explore the feasibility of erecting a permanent installation in the far south. This proposed base, shrouded in secrecy and cryptically referred to as Station 211, would fuel decades of post-war legends. Throughout the early 1940s, clandestine German voyages to Antarctica allegedly continued. A telling comment slipped by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz hinted at activities beyond ordinary naval operations. At one point, he remarked that his U-boat crews had discovered a veritable paradise on Earth. By 1943, Dönitz went so far as to proclaim with a measure of pride that Germany's submarine fleet had succeeded in building, for their leader, a kind of unassailable sanctuary in another part of the world. While historians continue to debate the literal truth of these statements, they underscored the mystical allure Antarctica held in certain National Socialist circles. This raises an enduring question: why, on the eve of renewed global conflict, did German officials deem it worthwhile to reach out to an American explorer like Byrd and invest substantial resources in what many might dismiss as a peripheral venture to the frozen ends of the earth? The answer is found partly in the fervent resurgence of German nationalism that swept through the country in the interwar years. In the wake of economic hardship and political instability after the First World War, movements like the National Socialist German Workers' Party capitalized on public discontent, rising rapidly to prominence. By the early 1920s, the party recognized the need for a dedicated paramilitary wing to safeguard its often volatile gatherings in Munich. This security arm evolved into the Schutzstaffel, or SS, which, under Heinrich Himmler's leadership from 1929 onward, expanded from a small guard detachment into one of the most powerful institutions within the German state. Himmler, drawing upon a mix of romantic medieval symbolism and contemporary nationalist ideology, envisioned the SS as a modern echo of the Teutonic Knights, an elite brotherhood charged with safeguarding and advancing German interests. While German propaganda of the time frequently invoked mythic images of knightly conquest and historic destiny, the practical aims were rooted in securing living space and resources to sustain what they saw as Germany's rightful position in Europe and beyond. Hitler's policies were driven by an uncompromising determination to lift Germany out of the devastation of post-war treaties and economic collapse, and to expand its influence, through both diplomacy and force, into new territories that could sustain the German people, materially and strategically. This vision of expansion, coupled with vast state-driven propaganda, laid the groundwork for ventures like the Antarctic missions, blending scientific exploration, national prestige, and a strategic hedge against the uncertainties of a looming world war. The National Socialist leadership maintained a firm conviction that any territory incorporated into what they termed their future living space needed to be carefully shaped to preserve what they saw as a culturally and ethnically cohesive population. Under this ideology, the concept of Lebensraum was not merely about geographic expansion. It carried with it a rigid vision of demographic engineering. The aim was to cultivate regions dominated by people who fit their standards of Germanic and European heritage. Hitler often criticized the political map of Europe, arguing that its patchwork of small states could not compete with global powers possessing vast internal markets and secure continental resources. He pointed to the United States as a model, viewing its consolidation of an entire continent under a single political and economic system as an enviable example. In Hitler's eyes, this allowed America to prosper largely unchallenged by immediate external threats, something he wished to replicate in Europe through German expansion. Within this framework, the notion of colonizing even the harshest corners of the planet, such as Antarctica, was not entirely outside the realm of consideration. Although its frigid, inhospitable environment posed immense challenges, it remained the last largely unclaimed landmass on Earth, theoretically offering a place where Germans could settle without being surrounded by rival nations. Whether Germany, during the war years, actually possessed the technical capabilities to establish a permanent, self-sustaining settlement in Antarctica remains highly doubtful, yet the dream of such a distant refuge fit neatly into the broader narrative of securing a future insulated from geopolitical encirclement. Beyond tangible resources like coal or minerals, there was also an allure rooted in more arcane ambitions. The mystique surrounding Antarctica dovetailed with certain strands of esoteric thought, circulating within the upper echelons of the Third Reich. As early as 1935, the German state formally established the Ahnenerbe, translating to ancestral heritage, an organization created ostensibly to research the historical and cultural origins of the German people. However, its mission quickly expanded into far more speculative and unorthodox directions. The Ahnenerbe was unique. It was the only government-funded institution of its kind in the world that combined historical research with open exploration of occult theories and mystical traditions. Its leadership drew from some of the highest circles of the National Socialist hierarchy. Under the personal patronage of Heinrich Himmler, the Ahnenerbe delved into studies ranging from ancient European runes and folklore to metaphysical and supernatural theories. Himmler himself was deeply fascinated by ideas that combined medieval mysticism with modern pseudoscientific racial doctrines, and he frequently pushed the organization to explore unconventional sources of power. Astrologers and occult advisors within the regime, such as Wilhelm Wolff, hinted at ambitions that extended well beyond material conquest. According to statements from the time, the ultimate objective of Ahnenerbe research was to identify and harness every conceivable source of influence, natural or supernatural. This meant drawing equally from contemporary technological advancements, obscure mystical rites, classical philosophies, and even the darker practices of medieval esotericism, all in the hope of securing Germany's triumph. Parallel to their Antarctic ventures, the Germans also dispatched expeditions to remote parts of Asia, notably Tibet, during this same period. These missions, cloaked in a mix of ethnographic study and arcane curiosity, reportedly led them to isolated cave systems that had been sealed off from the outside world for centuries. Inside these caverns, they claimed to have encountered ancient manuscripts, texts some enthusiasts later alleged were remnants from epochs predating known human civilization, or even linked to the legendary Atlantis. These documents were purported to offer guidance on locating mythical gateways to the so-called Hollow Earth, a subterranean realm that certain occult circles fantasized might be inhabited by an advanced civilization. In the fevered imaginations of these theorists, such a hidden race could potentially be persuaded, or perhaps even allied, to assist Germany in its global struggles. Some accounts claimed that beneath Antarctica's vast ice sheets lay portions of this lost Atlantean continent, reinforcing the belief among certain Ahnenerbe researchers that the polar regions concealed more than just geological secrets. Meanwhile, Tibetan mystics reportedly viewed the arrival of German expeditions through their own spiritual lens, interpreting it as part of an ancient cycle or prophecy, although such interpretations were often later romanticized or exaggerated by post-war writers. Taken together, these intertwining threads of geopolitics, mysticism, and speculative archaeology illustrate why Antarctica and distant regions like Tibet captivated the minds of certain German planners and ideologues. They saw in these remote frontiers not only the promise of untapped resources or strategic fallback positions, but also the tantalizing possibility of uncovering hidden forces, whether natural, historical, or fantastical, that might tip the balance in their favor. Some Tibetan mystics of the period reportedly believed the arrival of German expeditions to their remote regions fulfilled ancient prophecies that heralded the dawn of a new era of enlightenment. Whether these interpretations were genuinely rooted in long-standing Tibetan tradition or later embellished by sensational writers remains a point of scholarly debate. Nevertheless, such beliefs, real or projected, helped fuel the mythos that surrounded German ventures into the world's last unexplored frontiers. In modern times, scientific teams have indeed discovered vast subglacial lakes beneath Antarctica, some located more than a kilometer under the ice, with water temperatures unexpectedly warm, hovering around 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Above these lakes are immense natural domes where warmer air circulates, creating stable, cavernous chambers. It is theorized that over countless millennia, outflows from these geothermal lakes carved extensive tunnel systems within the ice, forming hidden corridors that could, at least in theory, accommodate clandestine human activity. Speculative accounts suggest that during the Second World War, German naval reconnaissance, especially by U-boats, might have explored or at least mapped parts of these hidden tunnels. In such remote, insulated environments, it is conceivable they could have identified sites for secret installations, shielded from the brutal polar climate, utterly removed from prying Allied reconnaissance, and protected from storms and ice drifts. This idea was later colored by remarks attributed to German Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Even after the war, Dönitz made cryptic allusions to a secure redoubt far from Europe, describing it as a kind of paradise amidst eternal ice. During the Nuremberg trials, he reportedly maintained that the German Navy had succeeded in establishing an impregnable fortress, a paradise-like oasis in remote regions beyond normal reach. Whether this was literal, metaphorical, or simply bravado remains unresolved, yet it provided ample fuel for post-war legends. Meanwhile, German ambitions in Antarctica did not escape the notice of the United States. In an atmosphere of mounting global tension, American leaders began to view any European power's efforts to establish footholds in the southern continent through the lens of strategic threat. A dramatic illustration of this concern unfolded on July 8, 1939, when Americans across the nation unfolded their copies of the New York Times to see a prominent headline, "President Directs Speed on Byrd Trip." In this story, it was revealed that President Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken decisive steps to accelerate Admiral Richard E. Byrd's upcoming Antarctic expedition. The motive was clear: to ensure that German claims in Antarctica would not spill over into regions the United States regarded as falling under the protective scope of the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt made it explicit that any attempt by foreign powers to establish military or colonial bases in Antarctic sectors west of the 180th meridian would be viewed as a direct challenge to American interests, an unfriendly act that might demand a response. Congress swiftly allocated $340,000 for Byrd's expedition. Byrd himself indicated plans to take 3 ships, including his flagship, the Bear of Oakland, which was undergoing significant refitting in Boston. Byrd even stated he would place the vessel at government disposal after the installation of a new engine. Thus, even before the formal outbreak of global war, the seeds of possible confrontation between Germany and the United States over Antarctica were already being sown. The German proclamation of Neuschwabenland signaled territorial ambitions that Washington was not prepared to ignore. Yet, interestingly, contemporary reports on Byrd's mission gave little indication that he or his men made deliberate efforts to shadow or directly investigate what the Germans were doing. However, a lesser-known follow-up piece, buried deep within the pages of the New York Times on November 30th, 1939, hinted at a more clandestine dimension. The article was headlined, "Secret Orders Taken by Byrd on Polar Trip." It recounted how Admiral Byrd had quietly rejoined his Antarctic expedition at the Panama Canal, this time carrying sealed directives from the highest levels of the US government. These orders, originating from the State Department, were reportedly so sensitive that even acknowledging their existence was initially suppressed. According to informants cited in the piece, Byrd had made a discreet journey back to Washington days before embarking south again, receiving confidential instructions directly from White House officials. What those orders contained has never been fully disclosed, leaving room for decades of speculation. Could it be that Byrd's true mission was more than mere scientific survey, that it might have involved monitoring or even countering rumored German activities on the ice? Some later writers drew parallels between this shadowy rivalry and the Cold War space race that would erupt between America and the Soviet Union decades later. In both scenarios, exploration and geopolitical competition became deeply intertwined. A series of obscure reports under titles such as "The Quest for the Inner Passage" further stoked intrigue by noting that Admiral Byrd hailed from a lineage tied to America's traditional elite, suggesting, in the minds of conspiracists, that his mission might have served broader, more veiled national interests. Whether any of this was truly a contest to reach mysterious lands beyond the pole, as legends would later phrase it, remains a subject of debate more suited to speculative history than confirmed fact. Still, the interwoven narratives of geopolitics, occult curiosity, and emerging science continue to lend the story of these Antarctic ventures an enduring fascination, half cold fact, half shrouded in the mists of myth. The enduring allure of secret agendas and shadow networks has long shaped interpretations of these polar expeditions, particularly when viewed through the tangled web of old European bloodlines and powerful fraternal orders. Admiral Richard E. Byrd himself was tied by distant kinship to the British royal family, a fact that lent him an aristocratic sheen in American social circles. But even more provocative was his standing as a 33rd-degree Freemason, placing him at the pinnacle of, from the outset, a cloak of confidentiality surrounded Byrd's ventures. One of his biographers would later write with pointed ambiguity that there were secrets that would not be talked about. These cryptic hints only deepened public fascination, especially given the identities of those bankrolling his polar exploits. Nearly all of Byrd's early major expeditions were financed by American tycoon John D. Rockefeller and his tight circle of industrialist allies. It was only Byrd's later Operation Highjump, after World War II, that was underwritten directly by the United States Navy, which in turn raised questions about shifting motivations from private imperial interests to overt geopolitical maneuvering. This overlay of fraternal symbolism was no idle curiosity. In 1928, during one of Byrd's most celebrated expeditions with pilot Bernd Balchen, they pointedly dropped Masonic flags at both the North and South Poles, a gesture heavy with ritualistic undertones. Balchen, adding his own flourish, left behind his Shriner's fez in Antarctica. When Byrd returned on his 1933 Antarctic expedition, fully 60 of the 82 crew members were themselves Freemasons. By February 5, 1935, Byrd formalized this symbolic conquest by establishing Antarctic Lodge No. 777 under the New Zealand Masonic Constitution, marking the first such lodge on the continent. To some, this was no mere ceremonial act. It represented the physical extension of long-established networks of influence into even the remotest reaches of the globe. As President Roosevelt had darkly forecast in his speeches of 1939, the flames of conflict soon engulfed the entire world. By December 1941, the United States was drawn irrevocably into the global maelstrom. Despite the breathtaking speed and scope of Germany's military triumphs across Europe, which at one point saw the National Socialists in control of nearly the entire continent, a grim coalition of Allied powers ultimately ground down the Reich's ambitions in a 4-year campaign of immense bloodshed. By May 8, 1945, German military forces laid down their arms in unconditional surrender. Yet a tantalizing question persists for historians and alternative researchers alike. Did the collapse of Germany's armies truly spell the end of the ideological and clandestine networks that underpinned Hitler's vision? Or did this merely conclude the first phase of a deeper, far more covert operation to secure the regime's survival in other guises? Evidence suggests that as early as 1944, while the Third Reich's fate still hung in the balance, top German planners were already laying blueprints for a long-range strategy of resurgence. War researcher Henry Stevens, in his provocative book Dark Star, describes a clandestine plan dubbed Operation Avalon. This initiative allegedly involved some of the most influential figures in the Nazi hierarchy, including Armaments Minister Albert Speer, General Hans Kammler, and Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann. Its objectives were straightforward yet audacious: to clandestinely evacuate immense fortunes, state-of-the-art weapon designs, and entire cadres of scientists and technicians out of Europe before total collapse, thereby establishing the foundations for a post-war comeback. Such an operation, if successful, could give rise to a self-sustaining, off-the-books apparatus, effectively a breakaway Fourth Reich, capable of wielding influence far beyond the formal structures of any defeated German state. Over the course of the war, the Schutzstaffel, SS, had already transformed into a quasi-sovereign entity within Germany itself. Under Himmler's iron direction, the SS built an unparalleled military-industrial complex, pioneering advanced aerospace projects, rocketry, jet propulsion, and novel weapon systems that outpaced anything the Allies possessed. This vast portfolio included supersonic jet aircraft, early flying wing prototypes that anticipated post-war stealth technology, cruise missiles, and the world's first operational ballistic missiles. Shadowed by even darker rumors were tales of circular, disc-shaped craft, so-called flying saucers, prototypes that allegedly harnessed revolutionary principles of propulsion. Whether these were engineering marvels still shrouded in secrecy or the exaggerations of captured technicians remains fiercely debated. Central to the more ominous threads of this narrative was the top-secret SS undertaking known as Die Glocke, or the Bell, developed at a clandestine facility in occupied Poland. Descriptions of the Bell are often sensational. A mysterious device housed in a reinforced underground chamber, allegedly capable of generating powerful electromagnetic fields. While some accounts wildly speculate that it could levitate or even warp space-time, more sober assessments suggest it was likely intended as a last-ditch attempt to create an advanced plasma-based weapon. Given Hitler's near-apocalyptic desperation in the war's final year, his demand for a Wunderwaffe, a miracle weapon to reverse Germany's crumbling fortunes, seems entirely in character. The Bell project, however, never reached fruition. As Soviet forces closed in during early 1945, the device and its key personnel simply vanished. At the heart of this mystery stood General Hans Kammler, a shadowy SS figure who held exclusive authority over Germany's most sensitive high-tech projects. Known for his ruthless efficiency in constructing vast underground production sites, Kammler also oversaw critical rocket development centers and, by some accounts, was personally responsible for spiriting away the Bell's core team and technical archives. Thus, as Berlin fell and conventional German forces surrendered in ruins, an undercurrent of operations continued beneath the surface, quietly diverting men, blueprints, and treasure into hidden channels. These efforts would feed the legends of secret Antarctic redoubts and even inspire later conspiracies, suggesting that elements of the Third Reich had simply slipped away, ready to bide their time and pursue a new chapter of influence far from the battlefields of Europe. The enormous wartime industrial machine overseen by the SS under men like General Hans Kammler did not only rely on cutting-edge engineering talent, it was also built on the backs of countless forced laborers. Throughout occupied Europe, millions were seized and pressed into service, with horrific contingents drawn directly from concentration camps. These slave laborers dug subterranean factories, assembled rockets, and toiled in lethal conditions to realize the advanced weapons programs upon which Hitler pinned his final hopes. The grim expertise in organizing vast construction projects under absolute secrecy, often underground or in remote areas, was precisely the kind of logistical mastery required if one intended to build an emergency refuge or covert complex in an environment as hostile and isolated as the Antarctic. By the chaotic spring of 1945, as the Red Army and Western Allies converged on Germany from all sides, Kammler, who by then controlled the Reich's most secretive technological programs, simply disappeared. On April 17th, he and his closest circle vanished, along with much of the documentation and technical personnel tied to Germany's most sophisticated war projects. Official post-war accounts suggest Kammler committed suicide to avoid capture, yet this narrative has always been shadowed by skepticism. Given his reputation as a cunning and ruthless strategist who had demonstrated remarkable skill at exploiting every opportunity, many researchers believe it far more likely that Kammler orchestrated his own clandestine evacuation. Supporting these suspicions are persistent, though not definitively proven, reports that Kammler escaped aboard a massive six-engine Junkers Ju-390, an experimental long-range aircraft originally designed to reach targets as distant as New York City. Its final flight path and destination remain unknown, adding fuel to theories that Kammler may have fled Europe altogether, possibly to clandestine sanctuaries prearranged well before Germany's collapse. The stakes of Germany's advanced military research were not lost on the Allies. After the war, Sir Roy Fedden, who led a British technical mission to assess captured German aviation technology, offered a sobering assessment. He remarked, "I have seen enough of their designs and production plans to realize that if they had managed to prolong the war some months longer, we would have been confronted with a set of entirely new and deadly developments in air warfare." Such statements underscored the razor-thin margin by which the Allies had outpaced Germany's most daring technological breakthroughs. Legally speaking, although German armed forces signed unconditional surrender documents in May 1945, the apparatus of the Third Reich itself, the ideological networks, certain SS factions, and hidden caches of wealth and research had not uniformly surrendered. In fact, Allied intelligence agencies quickly became aware of suspicious movements and covert post-war German activity, particularly in regions of the Southern Hemisphere. These unsettling signs prompted senior figures in Washington to conclude that the story of Nazi ambitions might not have ended on VE Day. In this context, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal authorized one of the most ambitious polar operations ever undertaken. Just a year and a half after the guns of World War II fell silent in Europe, Admiral Richard E. Byrd was placed in command of what became known as Operation Highjump, a massive naval task force dispatched to Antarctica in late 1946. Publicly, the mission was billed as a large-scale reconnaissance and mapping project, ostensibly to establish the United States' capabilities and presence in polar regions. But Byrd himself, speaking in unusually direct terms, described the expedition as primarily of a military nature, though he declined to elaborate further. Operation Highjump was staggering in its scale. It included an aircraft carrier, 12 additional warships, a submarine, more than 20 aircraft and helicopters, and a complement of roughly 4,000 personnel. Such a deployment would have constituted a formidable battle group anywhere in the world. Yet here it was, dispatched to the desolate expanses of Antarctica. The official record was carefully crafted. In 1948, MGM released a full-length documentary feature titled The Secret Land, chronicling the mission's trials amid icebergs, storms, and the technical challenges of operating in polar extremes. Yet for all its cinematic flourish, the film conspicuously avoided any mention of combat preparations. Indeed, historians later noted an odd deficiency. Despite being one of the largest naval armadas ever sent to the Antarctic, the force included virtually no fighter aircraft. The carrier USS Philippine Sea did not host its usual complement of fighters or attack planes. Instead, its decks were crowded with Douglas R-4D Skytrain reconnaissance planes, the Navy variant of the famed C-47, which were retrofitted for extended polar flights. Even the Martin P. B.M. Mariner flying boats, which played a prominent role in the operation, were geared toward broad reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols rather than offensive combat. Critics of the official narrative have long argued that this peculiar force composition would have been poorly matched against any serious military threat, such as entrenched German defenses that conspiracy theorists suggest might have existed in Neuschwabenland. Adding another layer of intrigue, these R-4D aircraft were equipped with state-of-the-art trimetragon cameras, an advanced secret photographic system capable of capturing wide-angle, high-resolution panoramic imagery across vast swathes of terrain. Such capabilities were far beyond simple cartographic mapping. They pointed to a detailed intelligence-gathering operation designed to document surface features and potentially locate hidden installations under the ice. Meanwhile, back in Washington and London, intelligence analysts remained deeply concerned that remnants of Germany's scientific and military elite had not simply vanished, but had instead reorganized in scattered redoubts, waiting for more favorable geopolitical conditions to reassert themselves. Thus, Operation Highjump can also be viewed through the prism of post-war power politics, a bold demonstration of American reach intended not only to secure territorial stakes in Antarctica, but to investigate, and if necessary neutralize, any secret infrastructure the Germans might have spirited away beyond the reach of conventional Allied occupation. As Operation Highjump's aircraft patrolled the desolate Antarctic expanse, they carried more than just cameras for topographic mapping. Each plane also towed highly sensitive magnetometers, designed to detect subtle fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. Any such anomalies might reveal vast hollow spaces or unusual geological structures concealed beneath miles of compacted ice, a potential indication of hidden caverns, natural vaults, or, as some theorists would later suggest, artificial installations carved out in secrecy. Once launched from the carrier decks of the Philippine Sea, these modified R-4D reconnaissance planes were reportedly intended to remain stationed in polar conditions indefinitely, operating from improvised ice runways or coastal staging grounds to sustain a continuous aerial survey. This level of commitment underlined the extraordinary seriousness with which the US Navy approached the operation. Though official records and film reels emphasized the peaceful scientific character of the expedition, persistent speculation holds that the carrier's lower hangar decks might have concealed a full complement of combat aircraft, fighters held in reserve should the mission encounter hostile forces. After all, no naval commander would willingly sail a major task force into uncertain territory without provisions for air cover, particularly amid Cold War anxieties about emerging Soviet influence or lingering fears of clandestine German holdouts. Originally slated to last up to 8 months, equipped with supplies, fuel, and contingencies for overwintering in the harsh polar night, Operation Highjump instead came to an abrupt conclusion. After just 8 weeks on station, Admiral Byrd ordered the fleet to withdraw, the task force steaming north back toward friendlier latitudes. This sudden curtailment has provoked decades of speculation. Was the retreat due to severe weather, hidden mechanical problems, or something far more unsettling encountered under the Antarctic skies? Upon his return to the United States, Admiral Byrd underwent extensive debriefings at the Pentagon. Though much of what transpired remains classified or lost to fragmented archives, tantalizing fragments surfaced. Byrd is alleged to have briefed a special congressional committee, warning them in stark terms that if war ever broke out again, the United States could face an assault from aircraft capable of striking from pole to pole at astonishing speeds, an ominous declaration that seemed to imply technologies far beyond any known contemporary arsenal. This narrative found reinforcement in South America, where Chilean journalist Lee Van Atta, reporting from Santiago, cited Byrd as stressing the urgent need for America to develop new defensive measures specifically designed to counter hostile planes coming from polar regions. Such remarks, if accurately reported, suggested that Byrd had encountered evidence, whether direct or inferred, that pointed to advanced aerial capabilities operating out of remote, frozen strongholds. Adding yet another layer of mystery, recently circulated Russian-produced documentaries, such as Third Reich, Operation UFO, feature the controversial testimony of an American naval aviator, John Serson. According to Serson, his vessel, the escort carrier USS Casablanca, was also deployed to Antarctic waters as part of Byrd's broader task force. He claimed that American Navy Corsair fighters launched from its decks actually engaged in combat with unidentified flying craft, described as silvery disc-like objects during an unexpected aerial assault. Yet this dramatic account is immediately complicated by the official record. The USS Casablanca does not appear on formal Navy listings of vessels assigned to Operation Highjump. Does this discrepancy point to a fabrication on Serson's part, an embellishment fed by decades of post-war rumor? Or does it hint at classified operations and retroactively sanitized ship logs purged to conceal deployments tied to sensitive incidents? In purely strategic terms, Serson's recollections are not entirely implausible. No admiral would venture such a formidable armada into uncharted polar territory without ensuring adequate air cover, especially given the possibility of encountering not just extreme weather, but unknown or potentially hostile forces. even within the conventional logic of Cold War-era naval doctrine. Maintaining hidden squadrons of fighters aboard secondary escort carriers would be standard operational prudence. Ultimately, the full story of what transpired during Operation Highjump remains elusive. Byrd's Pentagon debriefings were conducted behind closed doors, his more unsettling remarks filtered through layers of military secrecy and geopolitical calculation. What is left are fragments, official mission reports filled with cautious technical language, public documentaries that skillfully avoided controversy, scattered press interviews hinting at dangers never fully described, and decades of speculation by researchers who see in the gaps of the record the outline of a far larger, hidden contest. Following the abrupt termination of Operation Highjump and the fleet's return to the United States, Admiral Richard E. Byrd found himself enveloped by strict military secrecy. According to various reports and later testimonies, Byrd was explicitly ordered to refrain from publicly discussing certain details of his Antarctic experiences. The complete operational files for Highjump, including the more sensitive after-action assessments and intelligence briefings, have remained classified or heavily redacted for decades, feeding a persistent fog around what exactly transpired on the icy southern continent. Among the most controversial elements of this mystery is the alleged content of Byrd's so-called secret diary. In accounts that surfaced years after his death, these writings purportedly described an astonishing episode during his final reconnaissance flight over the pole. According to these narratives, Byrd's aircraft was intercepted mid-air by advanced flying machines, described as saucer-like craft, which forcibly guided his plane to a landing inside a vast cavern that opened into the Earth itself. There, he claimed to have encountered a group of European-type Germanic people speaking full German, warning him of humanity's destructive trajectory, and then sending him back to report what he had seen. Mainstream historians and serious researchers overwhelmingly dismiss this tale as apocryphal, arguing it bears all the hallmarks of mid-20th century pulp science fiction, later folded into conspiracy literature and embellished with themes popular in post-war UFO mythology. Yet an intriguing, if far less dramatic, documented fact remains. The Secret Land, the official MGM-produced documentary chronicling Operation Highjump, quietly acknowledges that Byrd's final scheduled flight over the Antarctic interior was indeed delayed by approximately 3 hours. The film attributed this to technical troubles, engine irregularities that required unexpected maintenance. Whether this pause was truly mechanical or something else entirely is a question that continues to animate alternative histories. Just 4 months later, in September 1947, the focus of strategic reconnaissance shifted from the South Pole to its northern counterpart. With geopolitical tensions escalating into what would soon be termed the Cold War, the newly formed Strategic Air Command initiated a comprehensive mapping and surveillance program over the Arctic. Fort Richardson in Alaska rapidly transformed into a bustling forward operations base, hosting squadrons of B-29 Superfortress bombers, aircraft that just 2 years earlier had delivered atomic fire over Japan. But these were not standard bombing runs. Alongside high-resolution aerial cameras, these B-29s were outfitted with cutting-edge electromagnetic sensors, magnetic anomaly detectors, and other classified instrumentation designed to probe for disturbances that might indicate concealed installations or unconventional technologies. Their missions effectively mirrored the magnetometric sweeps undertaken by Byrd's aircraft over Antarctica, suggesting a systematic American effort to scan both poles for hidden structures or activities. It was in these forbidding Arctic skies that the narrative took another curious turn. During multiple sorties, flight crews reported sightings of unusual craft that defied conventional explanation. They described metallic, disc-shaped vehicles exhibiting vertical takeoff and landing capabilities, parked incongruously on floating ice sheets. More unsettling were accounts of these craft slipping beneath the water's surface, only to re-emerge elsewhere, maneuvering with speeds and agility far beyond anything in known Western or Soviet arsenals. B-29 crews also reported being shadowed by these objects, which seemed to trail their bombers over extended distances, maintaining a deliberate, almost watchful distance. Upon returning to Alaska, these crews underwent immediate debriefings. All film reels, sensor tapes, and written logs were swiftly collected, sealed under top-level classification, and dispatched directly to intelligence centers in Washington, D.C. Whatever conclusions were drawn from these materials remained confined to the highest echelons of military command. Officially, Major Charles Moss, who oversaw the Arctic Reconnaissance Initiative, offered a measured assessment in his final report. He suggested that the craft observed by his flight teams could represent a highly secretive Soviet breakthrough, possibly derived from captured German engineering, given the well-documented rush by both the US and USSR to seize Nazi aerospace specialists and blueprints at the close of World War II. Moss's hypothesis fit comfortably within early Cold War threat frameworks and offered a rational, if still deeply unsettling, explanation. Yet, despite this pragmatic view, the parallels to Byrd's earlier warnings were hard to ignore. Both at the bottom and top of the world, within a span of months, American military operations reported encounters with flying machines that could leap from ice to air and from water to sky, craft capable of traversing global distances at unprecedented speeds. Whether these represented covert Soviet technology, remnants of German wartime experimentation, or something even more obscure, remains an unresolved puzzle woven deep into the early strategic anxieties of the nuclear age. Following the abrupt end of Operation Highjump, Admiral Richard E. Byrd returned to the United States, where he was soon admitted to a hospital for undisclosed treatment. During this period, he was also quietly steered away from further engagement with the press. Whether this isolation was purely for medical recovery or to impose a deliberate silence around his polar findings remains a point of speculation, especially among those who track the deeper undercurrents of post-war intelligence maneuvering. Yet remarkably, despite this enforced hiatus, Byrd's expertise was once again called upon a decade later. In March 1955, he was appointed to oversee a new and ambitious U.S. Navy undertaking, Operation Deep Freeze. This was not merely another exploratory venture. It marked the establishment of a permanent American military presence on the Antarctic continent. Unlike his earlier missions, Byrd's involvement this time was largely symbolic. He spent barely a week on the ice before returning to the United States in February 1956, leaving the complex logistical and engineering operations to a younger generation of officers. Byrd would not have long to reflect on this last chapter of his polar career. On March 11, 1957, he died in his sleep at his Boston residence on Brimmer Street, officially from heart complications. His passing was honored with full national solemnity, and he was laid to rest among America's most revered figures in Arlington National Cemetery. Still, the timing and circumstances of his death have prompted lingering doubts in some quarters, raising the inevitable question: did Byrd's silence carry secrets so weighty that even the end of his life remains shaded by quiet suspicion? Barely a year after Byrd's death, Operation Deep Freeze entered a dramatically new phase. In August 1958, as part of an extension of this program, the US Navy utilized the USS Norton Sound, a specialized missile test ship operating in Antarctic waters, to launch 3 rockets armed with low-yield nuclear warheads. These devices were detonated high above the polar atmosphere under the code name Project Argus, a classified operation whose stated objective was to investigate the Earth's magnetic environment. Official scientific briefings later credited this initiative with contributing crucial data that led to the discovery and understanding of the Van Allen radiation belts, a vast zone of charged particles encircling the planet. Yet the sheer audacity of detonating nuclear weapons over the Earth's last pristine frontier has fueled enduring debate over what else may have been intended. Some researchers have speculated that these high-altitude bursts served a dual function, generating electromagnetic pulses potentially designed to disable hidden installations, perhaps linked to rumored German enclaves deep under the ice. Whether or not this was ever the true purpose, no evidence has surfaced of any retaliatory action, from supposed German remnants or otherwise, against this unprecedented show of atomic force in the Antarctic theater. The absence of visible response has done little, however, to quiet the more speculative strands of post-war history, which continue to weave a web of covert struggle around these barren polar wastes. Meanwhile, another thread of this post-war tapestry unspooled far to the west, across the Atlantic, and deep into the southern hemisphere. Even as official Allied communiques closed the chapter on Hitler's regime, proclaiming the dictator dead by suicide in his Berlin bunker to a world desperate for finality, many intelligence operatives harbored far less settled conclusions. Within classified circles, persistent reports circulated that Hitler had not perished in the Reich Chancellery's rubble, but had instead slipped away alongside his most trusted lieutenant, Martin Bormann, finding refuge on a distant continent far removed from Europe's battlefields. I personally don't believe this to be true, but is still rather interesting. Argentina under President Juan Perón emerges as a critical sanctuary. Perón, sympathetic to many facets of European fascist ideology, was notably hospitable to German émigrés in the post-war years. He facilitated not just individual escapes, but entire networks of relocation. In the remote expanses of Argentina's Rio Negro province, a territory roughly the size of Massachusetts, whole communities took root, reshaping the cultural landscape with distinctly Germanic architecture, cuisine, and traditions. The city of San Carlos de Bariloche, nestled amid the snow-dusted peaks and crystalline lakes of Patagonia, became the emblem of this new refuge. Often likened to a transplanted slice of the Bavarian Alps, Bariloche flourished with German-language schools, alpine lodges, and family names that traced directly back to the old heartlands of Europe. Here, under wide skies and behind discreet private estates, it is said that many who once wore the insignia of Hitler's Reich found quiet lives, untroubled by extradition or accountability, shielded by local complicity and the vast distances from any tribunal in Nuremberg. For official historians, these stories remain shadowy footnotes, complicated by a lack of hard documentation and blurred by decades of rumor. Yet they form an inseparable part of the wider legend, that the war did not truly end in 1945, but merely shifted from open battlefields to a clandestine chessboard stretching from Antarctic ice sheets to South American lake shores, where pieces still moved in silence, guided by unseen hands. For at least a portion of the remnants of Hitler's shattered empire, Argentina became more than a mere haven. It served as a foundation for rebuilding influence on the global stage. In this new clandestine order, Martin Bormann, Hitler's long-serving private secretary and architect of much of the Reich's wartime economic machinery, is often cited as the pivotal figure who inherited control over the scattered but still potent legacy of National Socialist power. Bormann's true genius lay not in military tactics or propaganda, but in financial engineering. During the final years of the war, he orchestrated vast networks of shell companies, foreign bank accounts, and discreet property purchases to secure plundered gold, industrial assets, and enormous cash reserves outside of Germany's borders. When the military Reich collapsed in 1945, this hidden infrastructure ensured that its economic shadow endured, an invisible empire of wealth capable of exerting substantial influence across continents. Over the decades, glimmers of this subterranean influence occasionally pierced the surface. Secret transfers of assets, covert mergers, and quiet interventions in international markets suggested that powerful financial levers remained in hands loyal to a vanished regime. This backdrop would become inextricably tied to one of the Cold War's most controversial programs, Operation Paperclip. With the ink barely dry on Germany's unconditional surrender, President Harry Truman approved an audacious initiative to recruit scores of German scientists, engineers, and intelligence experts. Under the umbrella of Project Paperclip, men who had served the Reich at the highest technical and operational levels were quietly brought to American soil. This policy, justified by the looming Soviet threat, meant the United States effectively absorbed key segments of the Nazi state's intellectual elite. Among the most prominent was Major General Reinhard Gehlen, former chief of Hitler's military intelligence operations on the Eastern Front. Gehlen and his entire staff were not only spared prosecution, They were placed at the very heart of America's post-war espionage apparatus, eventually becoming a foundational component of what would emerge as the Central Intelligence Agency. Through Galen's networks, thousands of former Wehrmacht and SS intelligence officers found new paymasters in Washington, their vast files on Soviet operations now a prized commodity in the early years of the Cold War. Meanwhile, in the realm of technological ambition, the United States made an equally momentous bargain. Wernher von Braun, the brilliant yet deeply complicit architect of the V-2 rocket program, whose weapons had rained destruction on London and Antwerp, along with hundreds of his engineering specialists, were transplanted to American laboratories. Their expertise formed the core of NASA's propulsion programs, ultimately powering the United States to the moon. Thus, through paperclip, the Third Reich's cutting-edge military research was not only preserved, but became the bedrock of America's own aerospace ascendancy. Critics argue that in pursuing these expedient alliances, the United States unwittingly, or perhaps quite knowingly, allowed key elements of the Third Reich's scientific and intelligence machine to survive intact, effectively embedding themselves within American institutions. In this interpretation, Truman's policy represented a capitulation. The Reich had infiltrated and influenced the very apparatus of its former enemy, achieving through quiet deals what it could not accomplish by force of arms. Simultaneously, in Europe, the physical territory of Germany was dissected and partitioned among the victorious Allied powers, its cities smouldering and its people impoverished. But the ideological and economic core of the Reich was far harder to destroy. Through a labyrinth of transnational corporations, hidden trusts, and discrete partnerships in international banking, remnants of Nazi capital continued to circulate, subtly shaping global finance. The post-war decades saw German industrial giants, many of which had profited handsomely from wartime slave labor, reintegrate into the Western economic order, their pasts often politely overlooked in the pursuit of prosperity. This blending of old interests with new power structures did not end at banking. Aerospace conglomerates that grew from these same foundations often intersected with national intelligence agencies, blurring the lines between private corporate ambition and covert statecraft. Against this backdrop, it becomes an intriguing exercise to wonder just how far the technologies once seeded in hidden German laboratories, technologies hinted at in the closing months of the war by men like Hans Kammler, might have advanced in the secrecy of post-war black budgets. Today, the edges of these stories fuel persistent modern legends. Whispers circulate of secret fleets plying the void beyond Earth's atmosphere, equipped with propulsion systems born from principles first explored under SS oversight. Speculative authors and retired insiders occasionally speak of vast ships operating far beyond low Earth orbit, vessels that might belong to a clandestine multinational alliance, or perhaps something more unsettling. Under which banner, they ask, do these alleged craft sail? Do they bear the stars and stripes of the United States, or the lingering shadow of swastikas representing a Fourth Reich not in exile, but quietly triumphant in realms beyond any democratic oversight? These questions straddle the line between tantalizing possibility and pure conjecture, yet they persist precisely because the historical record left so many deliberate gaps. In the void created by classified archives, destroyed documents, and carefully managed post-war narratives, myths and theories inevitably flourish. And so, after tracing this extraordinary thread, from Hamburg to Neuschwabenland, from Operation Highjump to shadowy flights over the Arctic, from Argentine mountain lakes to the cold labyrinth of modern intelligence agencies, I want to take a moment to share my own thoughts with you. Because to me, history isn't simply a neat catalogue of dates, battles and treaties. It's a living, breathing organism that constantly provokes us to question, to weigh competing claims, to wrestle with ambiguity. That's exactly what makes topics like this, the tantalizing mysteries of German Antarctic ventures, American naval armadas braving the ice, and the swirling fog of secrecy, so endlessly captivating. So what do I really think of all this? First and foremost, when I look at the post-war period, the early years of the Cold War, I see a United States gripped by profound anxiety. The Soviet Union had emerged from the Second World War with an enormous conventional army, a ruthless intelligence apparatus, and soon after, nuclear weapons. American planners, from Truman to Eisenhower, lived with the gnawing fear that the Soviets might capitalize on any technological or geopolitical vacuum left by the defeated Germans. It's in that light that I think we have to see these massive American polar operations. Yes, they were publicly framed as exploration, but beneath that banner was an unmistakable undercurrent of Cold War urgency. The idea that the Soviets might seize any advanced German technology, whether rocket systems from Peenemünde or more exotic projects like those rumored under Kammler's SS umbrella, haunted American military and intelligence circles. Do I believe there was genuinely advanced German disc technology, literal flying saucers, spirited away to Antarctica? If I put on my most sober, evidence-driven historian's hat, I'd say it's unlikely. There is simply no hard documentation, no captured blueprints or verified test reports that substantiate such machines as operational reality. As fascinating as the concept is, rigorous history demands a higher standard of proof. But here's the critical nuance. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. The fact is, we don't have any definitive evidence disproving the existence of such projects either. We know vast archives of SS and Luftwaffe records vanished at the end of the war. We know entire teams of scientists disappeared, some under Operation Paperclip, others possibly to South America. We know General Kammler, who had absolute authority over all of Germany's most sensitive wonder weapons, simply vanished from history. No definitive grave, no proven capture. When we turn to Admiral Byrd and Operation Highjump, here's where it gets even more interesting. Do I believe Byrd was dispatched to hunt down rogue German holdouts beneath the ice? Honestly, no. There is no solid evidence of a direct military confrontation with Nazi forces in Antarctica. Byrd himself, in the official record, never explicitly said so. The secrecy surrounding the entire operation is undeniably strange. Operation Highjump remains one of the largest polar military expeditions ever mounted. It was meticulously supplied, planned to last up to 8 months, yet was suddenly called off after barely 8 weeks. Officially, logistical and weather challenges are cited, yet those explanations feel oddly thin for an undertaking so vast, so carefully prepared. Even stranger is how heavily classified so much of Byrd's after-action reporting became. Why should a simple exploration be so tightly locked behind security clearances that, even today in 2025, significant portions remain beyond public reach? Why would talking too freely about what Byrd saw and did in Antarctica still be enough to raise eyebrows, or worse, inside defense circles? And then there's Byrd's own life. Not long after Operation Deep Freeze, he died in his sleep, supposedly of a heart ailment. Perhaps it really was as simple as that, the final chapter of a life spent in harsh polar extremes. But the historian in me, ever alert to patterns, can't help but note how often key figures tied to these murkier corners of the war met quiet, convenient ends. Maybe that's paranoia, maybe it's simply the dark poetry of history, but I think it's worth acknowledging. Why did the United States Navy, in 1939, before Pearl Harbor was even attacked, begin moving rapidly to counteract German Antarctic claims? Why risk the prospect of war over frozen wastelands thousands of miles from New York or Berlin? Why such immediate urgency instead of quiet negotiation? And today, we see echoes of these old mysteries in the fact that Antarctica is still off-limits to ordinary exploration. It remains governed by a strict international treaty regime, effectively forbidding any private industrial activity, heavy excavation, or unmonitored scientific probing. Why such fierce preservation of a landmass otherwise dismissed as lifeless, frozen, barren? Now, as a historian, I always strive to strip emotion from fact. When I do that here, I have to admit there is no definitive evidence of any surviving Nazi enclaves beneath the Antarctic ice, no photographs of flying discs emerging from secret hangars, no documented dogfights between corsairs and saucer craft. But by the same token, there is also no definitive proof that the official stories tell us everything either. So much remains sealed, destroyed, or fragmented across intelligence archives. That vacuum, that stubborn lack of transparency, is precisely why these stories continue to live on. Because history isn't only shaped by what we know, it's equally shaped by what we're not allowed to know, by the silences, by the sudden, premature endings of official investigations, by the blank spots on maps. And in the end, that's what makes studying this period so endlessly compelling to me. It isn't about chasing pulp sci-fi fantasies, it's about grappling with the very real fact that governments do hide things, often for decades, and that the truth behind classified operations is rarely handed to us neatly wrapped. So that's where I stand. I suspect the real American obsession with Antarctica after the war was primarily driven by Cold War fears that the Soviets might capture something truly game-changing, whether old German tech or simply strategic outposts. Do I think there's still some rogue Nazi base operating under the ice today, nearly a century later? No, I don't think so. That strains even the most generous reading of the evidence. But do I think there were frantic post-war efforts to scour the planet for every last shred of German scientific advancement, even in the most remote and frozen corners? Absolutely. And do I think the deep secrecy surrounding these missions, the abrupt endings, the unexplained gaps, and the persistent high-level interest in forbidding thorough civilian exploration, all of that leaves ample room for questions that will probably never be fully answered, without a doubt. So now I'd love to turn this over to you, because ultimately, history isn't just about what I believe, it's a shared conversation. I genuinely want to know, what do you think? Was Operation Highjump really just a Cold War show of force? Could there have been remnants of hidden German technology spirited off to Antarctica, if only briefly? Why did the US cut short such a massive mission so quickly, despite having full fuel, full supplies, and more research to do? Why do you think talking about these topics still makes certain people so uncomfortable, even after all these decades? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Be honest, be detailed. I truly look forward to reading them. Because at the end of the day, history is best explored not in solitary certainty, but through the friction of competing ideas, shared curiosity, and the humble admission that in this vast, often bizarre world of ours, some truths might forever lie just out of reach beneath the ice. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's strangest mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and brings more of these thought-provoking stories to you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.